Before diving in, this video is available ad-free in an audio podcast form on locals.com. It's basically just a better version of Patreon for those who want to support the channel, and also my entire content library is up on Odyssey, which is a YouTube platform alternative for anyone who wants to branch out and also support for free. Links are down below in the description. Alright, so today I want to go in depth on why I have a serious problem with the entire review cycle for this game, that is Cyberpunk 2077, for a bunch of different reasons. And I realize this might piss off a few people, but it just needs to be said. Most of it really does. For anyone wondering, I'm now actively working on my own review, which is going to take a bit of time. I'm not quite all the way through the main story yet, but I've pretty much maxed out my character into the playstyle that I wanted, and I've also started to experiment with the other gameplay areas as well, finishing up activities around the world. I'm not done with every single thing yet, but I'm actually getting there, and I'm working on the review right now as we speak, which should be done in a couple of days. That being said, I have a serious problem with the general review cycle for this game, and instead of packing all that extra baggage into my own review, which would drag the length out to probably an inconsiderate extreme, I thought a separate video on these issues would be warranted. There's a lot of problems here, so I'll try to start at the chronological beginning. Cyberpunk 2077 has been in development for nearly 8 years and suffered numerous separate delays, but most of that cycle took place in a vacuum of secrecy. That's completely normal, that's the standard in the industry, but what isn't normal is how late it was before the review process could officially start. Don't get me wrong, I am not saying that any company ever must provide review copies to outlets or creators, or that they must provide a huge amount of time for them to cover the title, but when you compare the development time, the years and years of work developing as large a world as possible, as well as the multiple lengthy delays, and the massive advertised scope of the game, which is a marketing point that CD Projekt Red aggressively pushed in the lead up to launch, it seemed strange to compress the review cycle, if there is one, into a shortened time frame. But that's just the start. Coupled with this compressed time frame, which I'll come back to, there was this unheard of mandate that reviewers could not actually capture their own footage. Instead of recording what they played, they had to simply talk about it, overlaid on top of CD Projekt Red's previous marketing trailers. This is not simply an uncommon occurrence, it's a non-occurrence. I've never once heard of this happening in my entire career as a gaming YouTuber. And to go even further, this is not the detail that would ultimately be the most concerning. It was just one link in a chain of problems that have led to a review cycle disaster. A lesser discussed at the time, but far more critical policy was that there would be no current generation console review versions awarded. None at all. This by itself is extremely uncommon. I don't know of any. I don't think I've ever heard of a major release that was coming to multiple platforms, not awarding any sort of access to two of those three platforms, on top of the recording ban. However, the process continues to devolve. Mere weeks before launch, keep in mind that this is the window in which PC-only copies were being dispersed to reviewers and not console copies, and this is when the game has been delayed for 3 weeks after going gold, CD Projekt Red's CEO was quoted on their quarterly conference call saying that, here's a quote, an actual quote, "Cyberpunk 2077 runs surprisingly well on current generation consoles," end quote. This puts us in uncharted waters for a great many reasons. One of the largest and most anticipated games in decades. Short review cycle. Reviewers can't even capture their own footage. No one can even play the console versions to test them at all. And the CEO of the company is telling investors that the game runs surprisingly well on current generation hardware. Well, it turns out it doesn't. Launch day came and the game was met with what can only be described as an outpouring of criticism from current generation console players. There was performance issues, game-breaking bugs, crashes, and so much more. I have not played extensively on console. I've played a small amount, not a ton, and I can say that the performance is notably worse than what I was honestly expecting. I did not have any game-breaking glitches or crashes in my few hours spent playing, but in populated areas it went as low as I think about 15 FPS, and I don't believe that a span of more than 3 minutes ever went by without some sort of extremely obvious visual, audio, or mechanical glitch. Your mileage may vary. It's entirely plausible. Some people will go through half the game without ever noticing anything off. It is possible. But when I compare the performance on console to that of PC, even if we talk about just leaving graphics out of the equation, low versus high, it doesn't matter. Like, graphical fidelity is not the point I'm getting at here. It's an entirely different world, performance and functionality wise. Now, to be clear, I'm actually loving my time in this game because it checks off a series of boxes for my own subjective enjoyment that make me willing to overcome the flaws. However, I am not unable to see or discuss the problems that do exist for other players, and the review cycle for this game has been horrendous. Today, we got the full circle apology. To once again be 100% crystal clear, this is a good thing. I respect the hell out of CD Projekt Red for doing this, but even though they have taken such an admirable stance right now in the moment, we need to look at why they are even in this position at all. On Twitter, the official Cyberpunk 2077 account tweeted out the following. I'll paraphrase and summarize because it's kind of long. Quote, "We are sorry. We should not have hid the console version from everyone. If you want a refund, we'll make it happen. We plan to fix the game. Please give us a chance to do that." End paraphrase quote. Again, great to hear. It's pretty obvious that fixing and expanding this game will be their primary goal over the next year or so, at least, and I'm happy to see that they have continued their endeavor to operate as a pro-consumer company. Well, right now. But this whole thing is a product of them deliberately hiding the horrible performance of this game on current generation consoles, while the CEO tells shareholders, quote, "It runs surprisingly well." If this is surprisingly well, then what the hell were they expecting? Every single one of us needs to understand what happened here. The game was deliberately hidden. The performance problems were suppressed. The review cycle was locked down, and those that did receive a copy were disallowed from ever even showing what they played. The condition of the game was controversial, to say the very least. The console performance was and is bad, and it got so out of hand that CD Projekt Red is now issuing refunds when their CEO said not even 2 weeks before launch that the performance was surprisingly good. And if we harken back to the past 8 years of development, the game was made for and always intended to be a current generation title before all the delays. If any other company in the entire industry had done this, there would be no defenders and no excuses made. But that's just the foundation, because the review process is a disaster for reasons well and truly beyond the shrouded condition of the game. All of these policy decisions by CD Projekt Red facilitated a whole different set of issues, because when you make it impossible for anyone to show their own progress, when you force them to experience a vast tree of branching stories in the smallest amount of time possible, and you remove any sort of accountability or auditing potential from the audience because they can't even show what they did or how or when, you open the door for them to lie. This is a problem that extends a lot farther than many of us will ever even know about, and it's not just gaming journalists who are guilty of it. The best example is probably a GameSpot editor who openly admitted in the outlet's YouTube podcast that she never even cared to engage with a huge swath of the side content, and she did not participate in massive sections, arguably the majority, of the RPG systems. The claim is that she had played 50 hours of the game or so and gone all the way through, but a game-breaking bug stopped her from finishing the final mission. Sure, fine. Believable? Yes, absolutely. But when discussing the progression and customization systems, her response was that she did not care about them and did not even engage with them. Now, I'm not saying she or anyone has to spend hours upon hours min-maxing these different systems. I am doing that myself. That's kind of one of my goals in certain areas, and others not so much. But at a basic level, you need to, at the very least, engage with them to know what they are and how they work, as well as whether or not they are balanced and effective. If you ignore main sections of the game's character progression, how can you possibly review the title accurately as an open-world RPG based on a tabletop variant? And again, the example that stands above the rest is a GameStop journalist, but the reality is a lot of these people who covered this game early very clearly did not review it thoroughly, and simply squeezed out a review so that they could get maximum viewership as a function just of exclusivity. I'm not going to name specific people right now because many of them would probably watch this video and turn it into a giant headache, which I just don't have the energy for, but they know who they are. There are many legitimate critiques to make of this game, like a ton, but those major, glaring, obvious flaws just don't show up in almost any of the reviews that were allowed to be released pre-launch. Economy problems, AI issues, the fundamental mathematics of damage being totally and completely botched, with what seems to be exclusively multiplicative interactions. Even dodge is hard-coded in and can't be rebound to a new key, so double pressing a button can sometimes just get you killed or make selective looting a chore. There's a lot of things that are real problems, but where are we actually hearing it? We definitely didn't hear about most of those pre-launch. These are issues that one very quickly discovers when playing the game for just even a dozen hours or so, and yet these problems and a discussion of how they would impact the player base were virtually non-existent. Instead, it was, wow, impressive, wow, it's what I expected, wow, amazing. No one knows how much of the game these reviewers actually played, and it's painfully obvious that more than a few hardly played at all. No one could see the console version because it was simply not disclosed. And all of this combined means that on launch day, players were diving into an experience that had been deliberately protected, hidden, and even lied about by not just one, but in some cases, two separate parties involved. As it stands in my primary playthrough, I've cracked, I think, over 50 hours. I've got a build that deals almost 1,000,000 damage per shot, more reliably at least 100,000, 200, 300, 400,000, whatever, but a million at times. And I'm tearing through the content at a breakneck pace, but there's still just so much more to do. There are so many interactions and quest chains or decisions that I have not seen. I discover new broken mechanics and new amazing creative choices with every single session. And hardly any of these most important discoveries, the things that matter literally the most for a game like this, are visible in the majority of these pre-release reviews. But, as if it possibly could get any stranger, it does. CD Projekt Red had developer bonuses tied directly to review scores. This policy has since been lifted, and as far as I know, it's not actually uncommon. The industry routinely does this with Metacritic scores, unless that's changed in recent months and years, but the reality remains that you had unprecedented levels of suppression for pre-release review information and footage. A total lack, complete lack of any accountability for those that did receive the game. And if you don't believe me, just, okay, picture this. I could have done an entire video on Cyberpunk 2077 pre-release before it came out with no footage of my own, and I could have just said, I'm not going to include spoilers because the story is just so good and I don't want to ruin it for anyone. And no one could have possibly known that I was lying. I would have harvested a sweet payday from the viewership owing to exclusivity, and anyone who thinks that a pretty hefty chunk of reviewers didn't do something similar, or at the very least just put it on the lowest difficulty and cruise through the main story as fast as possible, if they even did that, some creators, some YouTubers clearly didn't even go that far, in order to crank out something fast, well, if anyone honestly thinks that a larger than acceptable number of both YouTubers and journalists didn't do that, I don't know what to tell you. This problem was exacerbated by CD Projekt Red's policies now causing them to issue refunds because of the gap between expectations and reality. And not all of that is their fault. Gamers had just absurd levels of hype for this game, hype that could never be achieved by anything ever in any version of reality, to be honest. But the review cycle for Cyberpunk 2077, I have a serious problem with it. From suppression of footage to pretty obviously phoned in reviews as a result, and ultimately now refunds of the console version because of these other alarming factors, the Cyberpunk 2077 review cycle has been a lesson in the worst possible way for a game to release after 8 years of hype and numerous delays. Do I have faith that they will fix the performance? Yes I do. Do I still enjoy the game? Also yes, absolutely. I wouldn't be making guide after guide after guide if I didn't, but I hope that everyone can internally, at least, maybe not externally, but internally admit that this has not gone well, and that a lot of different parties had a direct hand, deceptively, in making this happen, even if most of them will never admit it, and they directly profited from it on top of that. That's it for today. If you want to support, there's links down below, merch, locals, Odyssey, as well as another YouTuber to check out, but I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.